First one we're looking at is the abolition of slavery, and we need to look at the historical side of things as well as what's happening now, because slavery is by no means gone. It's just not as obvious. So looking at a little bit of history of this, slavery has been used for thousands of years, and it got a lot of things done. The people say, oh, the slaves built the pyramids and all that sort of stuff. Possibly not true. But it has been used for a very long time, and it has been the basis of a lot of societies. But the first thing that pops into your head when I say slave, you think black person. And I find you racist and horrible for thinking that. No, everyone kind of thinks the same thing. No one goes, oh, a slave. Oh, yeah, of course, an Indian. It's not like that. You go, all right, slave, black person, chains, big guy, all that sort of stuff. And you think, because you're thinking of the transatlantic slave trade, this is where Africans were being taken away from Africa and brought to America. Now, we think of that not because we're racist or anything, but there were 12.5 million slaves. Obviously, they estimated this because they had records, but obviously they weren't complete and all that sort of stuff. But it took 400 years to get those 12.5 million people across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to the United States, or to America as was. And that's why we think of it, because it's the one that they make movies about and all that sort of stuff. And the United States is still trying to deal with the negative aftermath, but they're still benefiting from that transatlantic slave trade, because the United States really wouldn't be what it is without them. Now, the abolition of slavery, meaning the getting rid of, so abolition meaning getting rid of slavery, really it involves two steps, and most people don't think of the two steps. They just go, all right, stop slavery. But there's two steps. Firstly, you need to end the slave trade, so no more buying and selling slaves, because that was, at first, the big deal, right? And then the second thing you need to do is set the existing slaves free, and it's very difficult to do both things at the same time. Really, you need to say, right, we're going to stop buying and selling slaves, and then, all right, the slaves that you currently have, that you may have bought a long time ago, you need to set them free, even though you've paid for them. So there was a lot of difficulty there. The major events in Britain, you had the Somerset Case, Slave Trade Act, and the Slavery Abolition Act 1833. So you can see the slave trade was gotten rid of in 1807. The slavery abolition, so getting rid of slavery, wasn't until 1833. So you can see the two steps, right there. In the United States, you had Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and then it really wasn't until the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that slavery was abolished in all states. And really, I mean, the interesting history that you don't really need to care about is that Lincoln really, if you look at that date, if you know anything about the Civil War in the United States ended in 1865. So why would Lincoln set a whole bunch of slaves free in 1863? Well, the reality is that he set them free only in the South, only in the area that he was fighting against. He kept all the slaves in the North, where he was from. That was fine, but he set all the slaves in the South free to cripple the people that he was fighting against. So really, like, he wasn't some great guy and just he's hanging out in heaven with Biggie and Tupac or anything. He was just doing it to win the war, and it crippled them because the South relied entirely on slaves. But it wasn't until later that the U.S. Constitution was amended to take away slavery. Now, slavery itself, if you fast forward through history, is against Article 4 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and against Article 8 of the ICCPR, right? In that it's a negative right. You have a right to not be held as a slave. But it's not over. Just because it was in the Declaration of Human Rights and the ICCPR doesn't mean that it's over. The UN Chronicle estimates that there's 27 million slaves today, right? The difference is that they're not big black guys in shackles that are coming off boats, because that would be fairly obvious. The difference is now that it involves all races, all ages, and different types of work. And the first thing that pops into your head is sex slaves. And again, disgusting. But we're talking a lot of like labor and all that sort of stuff. But it's not always entirely obvious. In Australia, for example, the first prosecution for slavery was only in 2008, and we're going to look at later at the Weitang case. You just have to wait. You'll be waiting. for it. But yeah, we're going to look at that case when we're looking at slavery and human trafficking. But overseas, Nepal only abolished forced labor, which is like they had a form of slavery in 2008. And Mauritania, I mean, there's still a form of slavery. And really, there are still economies that are, working only because of slavery, only because slavery kind of happens. And if you go online, you can probably, Google Australian slavery cases. And there have been examples like, bringing Indian guys here to pick apples in Tasmania. And treating them like slaves. They're really not free to leave, and it doesn't matter that they're getting paid a little bit. Really, if you don't have freedom, then you're a slave. Even if they're paying you quite well, which the Indian apple pickers weren't. So the abolition of slavery is still developing. We're still working on getting rid of it, and we're not going to be able to get rid of it until people stop profiting from it, and it's incredibly profitable. Making someone work for free or for very little money and taking their freedom away from them is highly profitable and very highly recommended.